Today's discussion focuses on multiculturalism and the complexities of interweaving intersectionality into our social work practice. We will explore our experiences working with diverse groups, supporting clients with complex intersectional identities, and the impact of technology and social media on mental health and identity. Disclaimer: please note that the insights shared in this episode are drawn from our professional expertise as licensed social workers and from our personal experiences. This conversation aims to offer perspective and spark thoughtful dialogue. It is not intended to replace professional advice or therapeutic intervention. Listener discretion is advised, as some topics may be sensitive or triggering. Thank you for joining. Let's dive in.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Social Workers Addressing Mental Health in a Multicultural Society. I'm Janise, and I'm thrilled to be your host in this important discussion. Our focus today is on the incredible work done by social workers to navigate the complexities of mental health across diverse cultural landscapes. Before we dive into our discussion, let me introduce our esteemed panel of speakers. Each of them brings a wealth of experience and unique perspectives to the table. First, we have Dr. Laura Quiros, our renowned expert in trauma-informed practice, dedicated social work educator at Montclair University. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much, Janise. It's such an honor to hold space with all of you today. So just as general introductions, my name is Laura Quiros. I identify as she, her. Those are my pronouns. I identify as a Black Latina who's also Jewish. And I say that first and foremost because as we are talking about identity, how I show up and the ways in which I am vulnerable about who I am really impacts the therapeutic alliance, whether I'm with an individual, a group, or a community. So I'm very clear about how I present myself to others. It's really important. So in terms of my background, I am an associate professor at Montclair State University, where I teach in the Department of Social Work and Child Welfare, Child Advocacy. And I am also a consultant where I work with non- and for-profits in the space of trauma-informed social justice. So I do trainings, I do executive team meetings, I work with boards, I work with leadership teams around the work of belonging is what I call it. So how do we make the organizational cultural space a place of belonging where we can feel safe and brave about bringing all of our intersectional identities into that space. I'm also a mother of 2 children, 2 girls, 16 and 10, that take up a lot of my time. I find parenting to be both healing, difficult, and rewarding in so many ways. So that's just a little bit about me, and I will pass it over to our next panelist. Thank you, Janise.
Thank you. And next joining us is Dr. Warren Graham, a Ph.D. candidate at Stony Brook University and an accomplished social worker with extensive experience in addiction counseling.
Thank you. And like Dr. Quiros, I'm excited to be here with you all sharing space on this very important conversation. I am currently the Assistant Dean of Practicum Education at Stony Brook University, but I am transitioning to be the Associate Dean of Practicum Learning at Columbia University in New York City. I have been in field education for close to 10 years. I am a practitioner. I have over 20 years of practice experience with a private practice with forensic populations. I also have a for-profit agency where I do organizational trainings around ADEI for nonprofits who are working with, the communities that we're likely to talk about today. I used to think that the only way to create change was at that macro level. And the longer I stay in the game and then profession, I realize that it's really in policy and advocacy. So I am NASW New York State President-elect, and I serve on one of the co-chairs for the Council on Social Work Education, being the Council on racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity. So again, I'm happy to be here and contribute to the conversation.
Thank you. And next we have Chelsea Singleton, the founder of Amplified Advocacy Initiative and Podcast.
Yes, I am so excited to have this conversation. A little bit about me. I'm a multiracial female. Background is Hispanic, white Native American. Grew up in the Deep South, so it is very different than most of the people that I am in school with right now, pursuing my doctorate. I am the founder of the Amplified Advocacy Initiative, where we focus on really focusing in on the voices of those who are not being heard or often pushed aside, as well as making resources accessible regardless of pay rate, if you're in a resource desert, whatever, what have you. I am also working in corrections at the moment. I've done juvenile justice in the past, moved over into corrections recently, and I have my private practice that is in with my nonprofit.
Thank you. Thank you. So happy to have you. And I will also pass the mic to Audrey George-Owens, Associate Vice President from Services for the Underserved, who also brings a wealth of knowledge in supporting vulnerable populations.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you. I'm eager to be a part of, and more so, listen to the conversation that's about to occur, because I love the voices that I've heard within the conversation. And so to speak about myself as an Associate Vice President of Social Services for the Underserved, where it's a large multi-service organization, I basically manage the behavioral health division within that organization, working with a large behavioral health population of individuals who have co-occurring disorders, individuals who are challenged with their housing and their mental stability. And I have an amazing team of individuals that work in support of maintaining and supporting individuals around, following through on their mental stability, making sure that they remain stably housed in a very challenging climate, and supporting them through that journey with an array of wraparound supports to make sure that they are successful. I'm also an adjunct professor at Yeshiva University. And in addition to that, I also have a little business on the side, Fire Wellness Solutions, where we provide therapeutic support to individuals in need of counseling. And with that, I will pass the baton back to Janise.
Thank you. Thank you. And again, thank you all for coming. I am Janise. I'm an LMSW and DSW candidate at Simmons University and AIRnyc's Director of Care Coordination in the Bronx. I have experience working with community health workers, and I'm also a tech advocate for bridging the digital skills gap in social workers to learn quantum physics to be objective in practice. I'm also a New York native and a single mom of a 5, 4, and a 3-year-old, relating to the challenges of being a millennial mom. So we could get started. Let's start by hearing a bit about your experiences working with different groups or multiple identities. Would anyone like to start?
Well, I know in my work, in working with different groups, we specifically provide an array of housing to individuals who are veterans, singles, family. And so within that population, we have every gamut and every walk of life, every nationality you can imagine. We service over 2,000 beds of individuals within this division and this part of the organization. And with that, we find that a lot of the individuals served, their needs are clearly they are underserved. And so it's a constant challenge to kind of meet people where they're at around the supports that they need to be whole and to be connected or reconnected back to what that actually means. A lot of times I find that, people have a lot of assumptions about what it means to be multicultural or to be poor or to be homeless. And those assumptions, unfortunately, label people and put them in categories that aren't fairly appropriate for the journey and the lens that this person sees life through and how they came to be where they're at. Because the reality is we have people who were licensed practitioners at one point in time in their lives. We have people who have had bath wealth. We have people who have families, that they may no longer be connected to due to life's journey and the challenges that have led them to be housed with us. But at the same time, it is always good to keep in mind that everyone's journey is a part of who they are. And so with that, sometimes people can experience those challenges. And with that, they bring forth a lot of sadness and a lot of loss of hope. And as practitioners, it's really important to be able to not get stuck with that, right? Because that doesn't really identify who the person is. That's just part of their journey. And sometimes if you give a person room to have hope, a room to connect to other aspects of this life, they can look at it through a different lens. But we have to be able to open that door, shine that light, and I think it makes a difference.
I think, Audrey, there were 3 things that came to mind when you were talking, and one of them is just a resource for people if they haven't listened to it. It's a TED Talk called Danger of the Single Story. And in that TED Talk, she says that it's not that stereotypes aren't true, it's that they're incomplete. And so I often work with organizations and my students and my colleagues around the need to ask questions and live in the space of curiosity rather than make assumptions. I think as a society, we're very comfortable making assumptions. We're not very comfortable living in the space of inquiry and curiosity, right? So that's one. The second thing is that, part of my lifelong work is helping people identify their intersectional identities. On the first day of class, no matter what course I'm teaching, I ask my social work students, how do you identify? And if I just go around the room, most of them say their pronouns and they'll tell me what they want to do with social work, but they won't tap into their identity. And so we spend a lot of time talking about who are you? How do you identify? What parts of you are you leaving out? And I model that, right? As I started here today, I identify as a Black Latino who's also Jewish, right? So this is me modeling for you. Where are your identities? Where are your intersectional identities? And so how do we help our clients live in the space of all of their identities? And the third thing that I thought of, Audrey, when you were speaking is within those identities, there are labels, right? So somebody might say, those students of color are at risk, or, using the word such as minority or marginalization or oppressed to talk about my people, right? To talk about maybe Black Latinas, to talk about maybe, Jewish individuals. And I always say, I am not, as a person of color, for example, in one aspect of my identity, I am not oppressed. I am a joyful, liberated woman. The systems oppress me, right? So I think we have to be really careful along this line of joy. I actually have a book in pre-production around joy. How do social workers evoke joy from our clients, given all of the trauma, given all of the marginalization, oppression that systems have put on us, right? So again, we are not marginalized. It's the systems that marginalize us, right? So how do we, again, as you stated, Audrey, live in the space of joy as it relates to our intersectional identities, even if they're labeled as oppressed and marginalized? We have to disrupt that narrative in order for people to come full circle in all of their intersectional identities.
And if I may, I think in order to disrupt those narratives, we have to teach people. We have to teach them that they have the ability, the power, the license to name themselves, right? Like they don't have to be part of, this single story, right?
Right.
Which has them walking around identifying themselves as oppressed instead of the systems that are around them that are actually oppressing them. I've done similar work, with my students, and I've been fortunate that a lot of the professional spaces I've worked in have taught me what it is to embrace my own intersectionality and in all the myriad ways that I show up, that I deserve and I require to be respected. I'm 86% sub-Saharan African and 14% European. So I often ask my students, can't I claim my Europeanness if I want to? Who says that because I am a proud Black man, 6 generations removed from slave ancestry, that is the only identity that I have to claim? But in my professional work, I've seen how systems, how they lean into biases, how they lean into prejudices, and how often it's the world around us that attempts to identify us and put us in the box. And, that becomes the challenge. I used to oversee adult and juvenile drug court programs in Nassau County. I started to learn as a young social worker about the experiences that actually bind and connect individuals, things like trauma, things like addiction. I had lawyers, I had doctors, and I had people who were borderline homeless and unemployed. And this common thread wove all throughout our experiences. So as someone was quick to talk about they or them or we, I was like, who was the we we're actually talking about? Right. So that exposure to diversity, I think we have to broaden how people experience diversity. It's not just diversity of race or ethnicity or gender, but it's also experiences, it's socioeconomic status. It can be so broad. And if we can do that, I think then we can amplify the voices of the people who need to be heard.
Absolutely. As you were talking, Dr. Graham, all I could think about was the reimagined version of The Color Purple. I don't know if everybody has seen it yet. If you have not, please consider doing it because it's amazing. Something that was said in an interview with Oprah, who produced it. It was an interview with Maya Angelou that she was doing. Maya Angelou said, "I come as one, but I stand as 10,000."
Mm-hmm.
And so that in itself is what we're trying to do, but also trying to find that balance of not identifying just as the oppressed, but acknowledging the fact that the system is oppressing us. Also, it takes, Laura said, evoking joy. Celie doesn't know who she is at the beginning, and these powerful women throughout the movie come and show her, these are the things that you are. These are the things that you can identify as. You do not have to be the oppressed person that you have been told your whole life that you are.
I saw it. And at Mary Ann, she actually came from, at that time, which would be considered wealthy. She was very wealthy in the age of that, right? So it's really interesting to see the rise and the fall and the rise, that the journey that people go on economically, but emotionally, socially, the journey that all of that takes you through. And it can be varying for a lot, but for people of color, largely, I think it has the most challenge and the most stigma, right? Society and stigma is westernized culture and other cultures around the world, and how they look at certain groups and how certain groups try and conform to what societal expectations are, how we talk, or how we walk, or what we wear. If you don't smile enough, you're an angry Black woman. If you smile too much, you are, there's a name for that. I mean, there's so many categories, right? And it's really unfortunate because largely those categories go to people of color, right? There's another segment of society that those categories, they're not labeled, other than maybe Karen. And so it just opens the door to just think about how society, how we all look at each other, how we judge each other, and how we actually should support one another more so than anything.
And I do want to bring up that what I think is one of the biggest challenges social workers face today is the need to stay informed and adaptable in an ever-changing social landscape. We have so many rapid advancements in technology and social media that it becomes important for us to continuously learn and stay objective to the nature of reality, right? Because this allows us to better support everyone, regardless of their position or beliefs. Another challenge I think about is addressing systemic issues that does affect mental health. So then racism, poverty, access to healthcare. I think there's not enough social workers that advocate for systemic change and working towards like equitable society on a higher level, in government, in politics, in the United Nations. And so I think today social workers need to embrace having a multidimensional perspective, staying curious and being committed to lifelong learning. And I think this approach is going to help us enhance our ability to support individuals effectively, empower us to drive systemic change on that higher level. Because, we've learned about like the social constructs of race, ethnicity, and this type of identification. As someone who, yes, I say that I'm Latina, but I'm also a New York native and I don't speak fluent Spanish. And so although I'm Puerto Rican and Dominican, I don't fully identify with Latina because I'm not Spanish speaking. And people come up to me all the time. They're like, oh, Puerto Rican and Dominican. And they start speaking to me in Spanish. And although I can respond in my Spanglish came from me working in restaurants with Mexicans in the kitchen. It does not mean that I identify fully as a Latina the way that it's stereotypical kind of way to identify. And so that's the reason why I feel like it's my own calling to call myself an intergalactic social worker or a multidimensional social worker instead of saying I'm a gender or a race or ethnicity, because I feel like I should be identified by my intellect and not by the way that my body looks, if that makes sense. And that requires, I mean, explaining this to other people and to social workers is new, right? And so it requires me to talk about, like, okay, well, let's talk about how race, who began race. Like, if it was back in the day, right, I'd be considered like mulatto or something else, and then I'd be identified based on my body and not really character. And so, it's a challenge, but also there's hope, because we could have this conversation and we could talk about this social construction that, yes, we're looking for identity. Intersectionality really helps us take a look at all the little pieces that make up one puzzle. And so I could say what I look like, is my intersectionality, but there's another part of my intersectionality that I want to identify with, that I tell people openly.
I really appreciate all of that. Thank you so much for sharing. I think that, when you were talking, Janise, I was thinking about the many markers of identity, right? Like, and so for me, identity is also about belonging. Where do I find belonging? And so similar to you, like, I wasn't taught Spanish because when my dad came from Puerto Rico, he was told not to speak Spanish, speak English. So why would he pass on that intergenerational trauma of a language that he was told not to speak, right? So he didn't, and I don't. And at the same time, there's so much about me that I identify as Latina because it beyond the language, right? So I think it's also about where are our places of belonging. What it means to be Latina for me may mean something totally different for somebody else. And so I think we have to allow room for that. The other thing when we were talking about, and Warren, this reminded me of when you were talking, and also Chelsea, I'm sure when you were talking about, the identity of biracial, multiracial people, it's also about, being able to own your privilege in a space. My mom was white, right? She passed away about 3 years ago, but she was white, identified in all of the ways. And I remember really poignant moments in our relationship when she would walk into restaurants, and like, she's a lovely woman, and also she had the privilege of whiteness. So she would maybe cut the line, or she would raise her hand several times in a restaurant if she wasn't getting waited on fast, all of these like ways of being, where I was like in my head, wow, like, how do you do that? I can't do that. And unfortunately, we never had those conversations because it felt too precarious for me. But that being said, like, you can throw me in any room with anyone and I can negotiate that space because I have been around whiteness in a way that other Afro-Latinas may not have been. And so I think for people who are biracial, and Chelsea, this is maybe our other podcast, but part of that responsibility, I think, is also owning your privilege in that space to be able to negotiate that. Like, I think biracial people are like magic because you can put us really anywhere, right? And so just going back to this idea of identity, and really a deep connection for me around belonging and around expanding those markers of identity. So when you shut your eyes, you don't have a fixed, representation of what a person who identifies as African or Latino or even, Asian looks like, right? It's very multifaceted. So we have to be curious as social workers, and we have to say when we don't know. And the last thing I'll say is, I think one of the most damaging things to our field is when I was in my master's program and there was a course on multiculturalism, and you'd have those paragraphs. This is how you work with Latinos. This is how you work with African Americans. And I still remember to this day, like, well, what about like the really mixed up person that doesn't fit in a paragraph? Like, where's that? So like, for all of us out there, like that Hutchinson human behavior textbook that has those paragraphs, let's throw that away. Like, it's over, right? So so that's the piece too.
You reminded me, I was in a diversity class in my undergrad. I was one of 2 biracial individuals in the class of 150 people. And I was specifically asked by my professor, what are you and why don't you identify as white? After I told her that I was Hispanic and white. And I just looked at her because I was like, I'm not. Society does not see me as one. They look at me like I'm crazy if I were to walk in a room and say, hey, I'm a white kid. But, that experience for me really followed me. So I was like, I should be able to say that. I was raised predominantly by my white mother. Both of my siblings are white. So I'm this little brown kid in a sea of whiteness. So it's just it sparked that core memory.
I was just going to say, when I was laughing, when Laura brought up that Hutchinson text, because, like, people are still using that. And it's challenging in a lot of ways, because when we think about identity, when we think about this whole social work education construct, the way we're taught as professors to educate students doesn't appreciate all the different ways and diverse ways that students actually show up. It doesn't teach us different ways of or methods of intervention, that may be based on indigenous practices. We're learning something very specific that was designed for a very specific population. And that doesn't always translate. So what we get out of that is a paragraph that says, this is how you work with Black men, as if Black men were just this monolithic group and that we're all the same. But to something you said, Janise, it is absolutely a challenge, but it actually does bring up a very unique opportunity, for those of us who may sit in multiple spaces, to educate the people around us, educate them that while you're looking at me, also know that if you're trying to put me in the box, you have to put me in this box, in this box, in this box, or this box. Matter of fact, so many boxes that maybe you shouldn't just put me anywhere. Maybe you should just ask me who I am and just be okay with that. But it is a precarious position to be in, based on whether the spaces you're trying to occupy respect the boxes you tick off. Because, for me, and while I do have white lineage, right, I'm blackity black. Like, people look at me and they're already putting me in a space. They're putting me in the space, and I have to decide in those moments. I can work a room, like Laura, right? But sometimes I'm thinking, does working the room require me to step outside myself and make people comfortable? Thinking about white fragility, right? If it requires me to do that, I'm not doing that. So it is a very precarious, it's a delicate dance, that we have to manage when we're thinking about identity, and because it's not just how we show up, but it's also how are people going to receive us when we show up authentically in some way.
Yeah. And I guess my question is, how do we address as social workers that extra layer of complex intersectionality? Because that's exhausting, right? Having to live within multiple worlds at one time, or feeling like you can't live in multiple worlds at one time and you have to constantly go back and forth. How do we address that with our clients that we work with, who are also experiencing that level of difficulty of having to code switch constantly?
I think one way is to start with ourselves.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think too many clinicians don't stop and take the how do they say, with the urine from yourself and self-reflection, right? And take a good deep look at who are you, right? What makes you all? What makes you all of who you are? What led you on this journey to be here today? Whether it be being a social worker, being whatever you identify yourself in, what led you to be here, right? And being able to look at that and understand what that means for you as an individual is extremely important, I think, to be able to help others to be able to walk that path and understand more than just their worldview, but that lens of intersectionality. And how do you see yourself? How do you think others see you? How do you want others to see you? How would you, again, how would you like to be seen? Because those are different rooms. And they don't always align when you step back and look at it. So I think that in itself is a whole nother conversation for everyone to stop and have, first with yourself and then outwardly with others. And in supporting those that we serve, sometimes those conversations take us on a journey.
Okay.
Right? Because these stories that people have, and everybody has, the stories can be very, very intriguing and very deep and very emotional. And sometimes with telling those stories, a lot of doors open.
It's so ironic, Audrey, because, we were taught back in the day to not disclose, to not use ourselves, right? And so I've always pushed back on that because I'm like, how do I not use myself, right? It's a very fine line between sort of centering yourself versus what I call use of self, right? Like using yourself in those situations to deepen the therapeutic alliance by the client seeing you as a person and human who's also had experiences. But in order to step into that practice of use of self, you have to have done your work, right? So I'm very conscious about ways in which I use myself. I use myself a lot. I share a lot about myself with my students, but those parts of me that I haven't worked through in my own therapy stay there, right? So like I'm very clear about what I've worked on, what will open the space, and what I need to continue to work on. And then once I do that, I'd be able to use it. But I think it's a very delicate balance. And I'm always shocked when some of my students haven't been through therapy themselves or haven't seen a social worker, because to me, it's like you ask our clients to tell the deepest parts of their lives, the most traumatic spaces, but you can't do that with yourself. Like we need to think about that and we need to challenge that, because if we're not, then we're just, we talked about power before. We're gatekeepers. Gatekeepers have power. If you're not opening up yourself, then you are only in that position of power in a non-reciprocal relationship. And that goes back to, the part of social work we don't like, right? Which is sort of a white savior-esque type of situation. So absolutely start with self and this practice of use of self.
And if I can add to that, and we have to, not only should we be asking ourselves a question, like Audrey said, right, holding up that mirror, but we need to support our fellow educators in them challenging students to do that. Them challenging students, like Laura said, to really think about use of self and always think about your why. I find quite too often that students in this kind of critical inquiry, they don't focus enough on their why. The why becomes their motivating factor, and it's almost like they'll lose their sense of self if they deviate off of that line where their why is. And they need to understand that this is complex stuff, and it is absolutely going to open up Pandora's box. And you have to be prepared for what you find in there, because guess what? Multiple truths can exist. Wonderful Aunt Betty who baked cookies for all the little kids in the neighborhood. But as you grow up, you realize she never shared them with kids of color. You may think Aunt Betty was wonderful. She may be wonderful, but she may also be racist. And both of those things can be true. And, students, us practitioners, have to be ready to deal with that. How do we reconcile that or resolve that within ourselves? And what does that mean for us and how we show up? So we absolutely have to push the envelope and, move away from social work and social work education as a business and get back to, what I think it was actually designed to be. If this is the pathway to healing, then let's do all the ugly, nasty stuff we need to heal.
Yeah, I was thinking about just like, again, I see that tech and social media has been super big now with the new advances of AI and ChatGPT and all of these softwares that our tech engineers of the world are now creating. And if they're not social workers, but they have this privilege and power and they're creating these platforms that we all use now, this does affect the social work profession a lot. We hear a lot about algorithms and how algorithms can potentially be biased because they're, mimicking the creator's beliefs. And so my question to close this off is like, how do we help our clients and the people we work with, both on a micro level and a macro level, to be ahead of this type of new scenario that we're dealing with, especially when we're still struggling with identity and dealing with intersectionality? And again, we're thinking about people's mental health. And recently I've seen now they're trying to ban cell phones in high schools because they're saying it's affecting the mental health of teenagers, which they haven't even begun to identify themselves. And so what are your thoughts around that?
I have a trainer, right? And my trainer, when I complain about how much weight I'm gaining, my trainer says, "What are you eating?" Right. So I would challenge people, what are you eating? What are you consuming? What are you exposing yourself to? We all know about these algorithms, right? We know that they're mimicking the mindset of someone who probably doesn't look like us. And we know the more you look at something, you click on something, it's going to feed that to you. So what are we exposing ourselves to, right? Because guess what? Increased cell phone use in adolescents is proved to be harmful. But you know what else is harmful? Lack of attention paid to historical accuracy, the removal of CRT in our schools, having students go through K through 12 not feeling like they are legitimate, like they really exist in this country because they have no place in the textbooks. So that's harmful too. So I would challenge everyone to think about, for your own mental health, what are you exposing yourself to, right? Because what we haven't looked at is how long does it take to change the algorithm, right? How long does it take to reverse the effects, the damaging and dangerous effects that AI and social media has had on individuals' mental health? So we do need to work backwards, but we first need to ask ourselves, is the hour I spend on TikTok, is that necessary? Is that helpful? Is that hurting? Is that self-care? Is that self-deprecating behavior? Exactly what are we doing?
It's so true. I'm a doom scroller myself.
Me too.
Yeah, I feel like, I don't know, I'm pretty old school. Like I still get the paper delivered. I've never been on Facebook. I'm really trying to keep my life as simple as possible and my children's lives. And I think what I always go back to are my values, and my purpose. I feel like I enter spaces or try to from the place of humility and from the place of curiosity as much as I can. I think anxiety is really can be really damaging in certain ways and forces us to kind of validate our existence or look for things that we are trying to get ahead, right? This idea of getting ahead. So, I mean, my answer is really quite simple and is understanding, I think, what Audrey said, starting with ourselves, understanding who we are, understanding what our values are, what our purpose is. I think the beauty of social work is that a truly purpose-driven field. Like I know I am here for a reason, right? My purpose is to create spaces of inclusion, of belonging, of equity. Like that's why I'm here. That's why I do the work that I do. And so I think as long as social workers remain connected to their purpose, which may shift, right? I think we'll be okay, right? Where we're not focusing on the grade, where we're not focusing on who's best in the class, but why are we doing this work? It's really centering if we just sit in moments of meditation on why we are doing this work. Always coming back to that purpose, I think, is really helpful.
Any last minute thoughts?
I want to say thank you to both of our panelists today for honestly giving us a podcast that I think none of us thought we actually were going to get at the end of the day for this assignment, let alone for any use for anywhere else. I have a podcast where I analyze or I use movies and music as a form of a medium to talk about mental health and social justice, hence why The Color Purple came up in my mind automatically. But, being able to speak with people who speak my language intellectually and in the social work mindset is an opportunity that I think, is rare now, especially as you age and you're not in the world of academia. It's very hard to have these conversations on a day-to-day basis. So this is a unique and empowering experience for me. I know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you so much. I think even social workers all over the world can take a lot from this podcast, especially thinking about holding a mirror to yourself and thinking about the intersectionality of the people we serve. And I think those were just two of the most important places that anyone can start. I mean, even if you're not a social worker, you can start there. And then moving more towards continuously being curious, updating yourself on up-to-date modern knowledge so that you can, I mean, aside from, newspapers, totally good. I think you're, Dr. Laura, you are safe from the doom scrolling, which I totally commend. I wish I was had some of those habits. So thank you again. I really appreciate it. And there's so much knowledge and information that we've all shared collectively. So thank you again.
You all have a blessed weekend. Be safe.
You too. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners.